As long as Hindus didn't step up and speak for themselves, I think it was all fine. But look, India is a rising power. India is majority Hindu, and India's diaspora is majority Hindu. One of the most successful diasporas in the world, one of the best educated. In every country, wherever there's Indian diaspora, the model minority, the Indian diaspora doesn't go and knife anybody, the Indian diaspora doesn't go and bomb anybody, the Indian diaspora creates no trouble at all, right? I was telling somebody from the UK the other day, it's not the Indian diaspora who creates grooming gangs in the UK, So, such a successful community, the Hindus, will want their share of attention, right? I mean, and why not? I mean, I think the community contributes positively in every part of the world where Hindus are, right? And finally, the Hindus are at a point where they're saying that, look, we contribute so much, education, money, talent, skills. Therefore, we deserve more attention, more protection, a better status, and I think that's absolutely fair, and you'll see that this happen more and more.
He's an author, he's a journalist, and he's an award-winning historian who has written many books in the past, and the latest one being Sing, Dance and Pray, the inspirational story of Srila Prabhupada, Founder-Acharya of ISKCON. I'm joined by none other than Dr. Hindol Sengupta for a conversation for this special podcast between Swarajya and Bharatvaarta. Dr. Sengupta, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much. Namaste to you. How was your flight to Bangalore?
Good. I always enjoy coming here, though of course the traffic could be better.
I usually have this routine of asking every guest who comes down to my studio, what do you find special about Bangalore? Especially I ask you this because you being a Bengali, I consider Calcutta a second home because, I feel very close to the people and the city.
Okay. No, I actually always like Bangalore. I've been coming here for many, many years. It's probably 10 years, maybe more, that I've been coming to Bengaluru, for work and to meet friends and so on and so forth. Of course, coming from Delhi, we used to escape to your city during the harsh Delhi summer, which seems to go on and on. So that you can't escape the fact that once you land in Bangalore, you feel at peace primarily because of the weather.
Right.
But having said that, also I love Bangalore because it's a place which is full of wonderful bookshops. Yes. And I'm very fond of the bookshops of Bangalore. I've spent many happy hours at various bookshops of Bangalore, including Blossoms and so on and so forth, right? And there's something special about the bookshops of Bangalore. I remember when I used to first come here about 10-15 years ago, this idea that you can buy second-hand books, which was there in my childhood in Calcutta, that has disappeared in most cities. Right. But I think it remains alive in Bangalore, and I think that's really wonderful. Of course, the traffic has become worse and worse over the years, but the food is great. The people are relaxed, and of course, Bangalore has beautiful temples. I of course knew the ISKCON temple in Bangalore for a long, long time. And now, of course, on the outskirts of Bangalore, there's a new Rajadhiraja Govinda temple, which is also really, really beautiful. So, there's nothing not to like about Bangalore. I have spent many, many happy days in this beautiful city.
Happy to have you here, and I hope you have a very pleasant stay. The idea of these bookshops were at a point very romantic to people who enjoy reading books and go out on dates and things like that. So this has been an experience for many of us in the recent past. But today, being an author and also as somebody who consumes a lot of books yourself, there's this technology boom which has enabled a lot of people to read a lot of literature without having to go somewhere else to purchase a book. But how do you see that? Because personally, I enjoy the golden rusty pages of a book. I like to pick up a physical copy rather than read a Kindle.
No, absolutely. Look, what has happened really is about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I think there was this whole thing that everything will move to Kindle.
Yes.
That clearly hasn't happened.
Okay.
Actually, more people are buying physical books than ever before. What is happening though is something very interesting, which I don't think one thought of or assumed 5-6 years ago when people began talking about Kindle and how everything will move to the mobile phone, is the audio revolution has really taken over. Right. Many more people listen to books, than ever before.
Right.
And it's interesting, right? We all thought, or many people told us, that radio as a medium was dying.
Yes.
But I think audio as a medium really sort of, took off again.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that why this is true, and I spent many years as a television journalist. I used to be a radio jockey back in the day,
Right.
when I was in college with All India Radio. So I've always been very fond of radio and audio as a medium.
Right.
The reason I think people didn't assume that this would happen, but then podcasting took off, and then it sort of, has become really huge. I think one of the things that people didn't realize is that there would be a lot of fatigue with the screen. About 5-6 years ago, everybody thought everything was going to move to the screen. Everybody would read books on the screen and blah, blah. While that has happened to a degree, it hasn't happened to the extent that people thought would happen.
Right.
That people thought everything would shift to, handheld devices. But what we didn't account for is that there is a fatigue with the screen. Right? You don't want to constantly hold something,
Yeah.
You get tired, and, it sort of fatigues your mind. What happens with audio is very beautiful, because it's the one medium that doesn't intrude into whatever you're doing, right? It's not like watching something or reading something.
It takes away 10% of your space.
It's just something that you can listen while, whatever else you're doing, right?
Right.
You could be working, you could be whatever else you're doing,
Yeah.
and you can continue to listen to it, right? So therefore, I think human beings want more and more things that would demand less from them.
Yeah.
And I think audio doesn't demand much from the listener.
Yeah.
And that's why it's become really huge. Even, I hear of a lot of people who work on YouTube and make YouTube videos and so on and so forth. They actually find that many people are listening to them,
Yes.
and not necessarily watching the video.
I have a lot of requests that come in where, they ask me to upload this to audiobooks and Kindle and, not Kindle, but the other platforms like Spotify and all of that. So I was actually quite surprised that they would want to listen to the same conversation, but just on audio, and they don't want to see our faces.
Yeah, and and that also means that the old problems of having to have a good location. When we were in TV, we were always bothered that the location has to be right and the lighting has to be right, and then because if it doesn't look nice, then there's no magic in TV, right? And then you had to get all these elements right and so on and so forth. But now it's easier, right? Your production can be sort of less elaborate, because finally people will listen to it. So as long as the audio is clear and distinct, people are accessing it.
No, it's a very positive thing that people are starting to listen, because I think that had become a problem with many in the country. So it's definitely a positive sign. And speaking of listening, while I was driving on my way to the studio, I was listening to George Harrison. And we will delve into that a little bit, because I think as a people, as a community, are somebody who's rooted and who's Indic, but is still, westernized in a certain sense of speaking, in terms of consuming a lot of pop culture, literature, books, and those sort of things. But I read your I don't know if it was your last book, but I read your biography on Sardar Patel, the man who saved India. It was a fantastic book, and it's one of the best books that I've read in the recent past.
Thank you, it's very kind.
So as soon as, Kritika got in touch with me, I was really happy to do this. And in fact, I wanted to do this in person so that I could ask you a lot of questions.
COVID is now finally seems to be leaving us.
Yes.
So it's great to meet people face to face.
So let's discuss the book a little bit. What made you take this up? Was it a request, or you wanted to write? Because I also heard that you were closely connected to ISKCON since a very long time.
Yeah, so as you know, I'm also the biographer of Swami Vivekananda.
Yes.
So I have been writing about Hinduism and its dramatis personae, so to speak, for some time, right? And as I have mentioned in many interviews, being a Bengali, ISKCON was obviously, influential in Calcutta, and they have a very large footprint there. As a child, I went to Mayapur, which is the great, ISKCON temple at Mayapur, and I remember, we would go for school trips from Calcutta to Mayapur to see the temple, and of course with my family and so on and so forth. And my mother has always been very, very close to Krishna consciousness, so to speak. Our family deity, if there is one, is Sri Krishna. Okay. So we've had this in our family and in our culture for a long time. When we lived in Calcutta, the big festival or the big function that we would organize in our family, like literally my parents, would be Janmashtami every year, right, because it was so close to my mother. So I grew up with seeing all of that, right? Okay. And therefore, after I wrote Patel, I was very busy with a lot of other work, and I was thinking, what should I do next? And Srila Prabhupada seemed particularly interesting because so little is known about him. Yes. We know a lot about ISKCON, yes, but less about Prabhupada. Even though Prabhupada's life is quite incredible, yes, he really, in a sense, he really began his work at the age of 70. He, of course, had become a monk by then, but it's not widely understood that he really lived her entire sort of what in the Hindu sort of framework would be considered a grihastha life, He had a wife and he had children and so on and so forth. But he was, even though he was leading a civilian life, so to speak, he was always very, very close to this idea of leading an ascetic life and devoted to Sri Krishna. And around the time that people retire, so to speak, so did Prabhupada, but of course he took the other, sort of more expanded step, yeah, of sort of, moving towards an ascetic life, leaving behind his civilian self, right? And he then tried to build a movement in India, but he wasn't very successful. He went all around the country trying to sort of mobilize resources to build this movement, until he actually, landed up in America. Yes. And it's in America that he was able to build this incredible movement. We were talking about audio. Here's the interesting thing. If the age of the podcast is here, the age of the kirtan is also here, because I feel that I don't think we have understood the importance of kirtans in our life. Yeah. There is something like meditation, the idea of chanting in kirtan centers us. Right. And I think Prabhupada was really one of the early people who understood that very clearly, and understood also how to place it in a modern context, right? So in a sense, like Vipassana was given a sort of modern shape and form, yeah, in India. Yeah. Of course, Vipassana, goes back all the way to Lord Buddha. But, the great masters and, sort of gave Vipassana a whole shape and form in the modern age. I think Srila Prabhupada gave chanting and the idea of kirtan a modern context. And he was able to explain to many people, including people in America, how it would help them in their day-to-day life.
And in this context alone, I think the sanctity has been maintained even after there's a lot of attempt by the Western population to sort of understand what kirtans is all about, and to understand the whole movement that he brought about. Yeah. Because if you look at if I may use the word, bastardization of Indian culture today in the West, you look at things like goat yoga and the ridiculous amount of things that's actually going on. You look at the Hare Krishna movement, it actually transpired in a very Indic way, so to speak. But since you were also mentioning that there was not great reception for Prabhupada here in India, what do you think made that difference in America? Why do you think he was not received very well in India?
Yeah, just to quickly segue, people of course say these things, bear yoga and goat yoga and whatever. Yeah. I don't think we should pay too much attention to this. Look, and we in India should understand this. We have 1.3 billion people, maybe 1.4 now. There are billions of people in the world. There will always be some people who will do some crazy things. What happens is, I think we start to give them spotlight and attention, right? And that actually fuels it. Otherwise, who cares? Like some guy doing some beer yoga somewhere. It's nowhere close to mainstream or anything. Yeah. By giving it, the fuel of spotlight, right, I think we sort of encourage this sort of,
absolutely right,
idiosyncrasies, so to speak. We should just ignore these people, But to answer your other question, look, Srila Prabhupada himself was a fascinating character. He had a great sense of purpose, Otherwise, look, at the age of 70, nobody gets up on some cargo ship and goes to America with like trunk loads of books and some 40 rupees and says, I will try and build a movement there, you know. And to be honest, when Srila Prabhupada first landed in America, he wasn't certain that he would be able to, you know, build a movement or anything like that. In fact, if you read my book, I mean, there's this entire portion where he's essentially telling Krishna that I have no idea why I have, you know, like why you brought me here. And, you know, now it's up to you, you know, you decide what you want me to do and I'll do it. So I think he had that great sense of leaving it up to the Lord or leaving it to the Lord. That sense of submission. In our culture, we say Sharanagati, you know, submission to the divine. That is not easy. But I think Srila Prabhupada certainly had that, you know, he had that sense of Sharanagati, which was very, very valuable and powerful. The other sort of more, you know, prosaic reason, of course, was that his ideas and words fell to a very receptive audience. Please remember, he landed up in America, which was going through great turbulence. You know, in fact, I said in one of my lectures that many of the things that were unleashed in American society are alive in that society even today. You know, the kind of tribalism that American society saw during the civil rights movement and then during the anti-Vietnam protests and so on and so forth, right? All of that tribalism in, you know, America is the great melting pot. But the fissures of that tribalism has always been there in that society. And those fissures are coming out even today. You know, there's so much talk of America splintering through its heart, so to speak. All of this is not new. This is all remnants of old fissures in that society.
In fact, I was about to ask you why the movement is still very popular even today in America and holds that relevance, but I think you answered my question.
No, so Srila Prabhupada's, you see, there were so many, you know, lakhs and lakhs of people or tens of thousands of people in America at that time who were rejecting the mainstream of American society, so to speak, who wanted a sort of a life away from what we today call the military-industrial complex, right? Who rejected war, who were rejecting the sort of uber-materialistic lifestyle that capitalism had engendered in America, right? And to them, Srila Prabhupada seemed like a wonderful option. You know, he was this man who was as far away from the military-industrial complex of their own country as was possible, you know. He was a monk, he was vegetarian, you know, he only spoke about, you know, playing the, you know, mridangam and singing and chanting. He was also telling them things that was very important to American life, you know. He was telling them to wash their hands before eating and to remain, if they couldn't remain celibate, be faithful to one partner and so on and so forth. And imagine saying these things to a generation, you know, the flower power generation, so to speak, in the middle of the beatnik generation, all that, you know, the summer of free love and so on and so forth, right? You know, today we use the word radical compassion. So Srila Prabhupada, I think, showcased radical compassion all those years ago, because he was stern with his pupils, but he was radically compassionate. He was not telling them that, oh, you can just go and do whatever you feel like. He was telling them, what you're doing is wrong, but there is a better way, and I'm here to tell you what that better way is, and that better way is submission to Krishna, right? Now, that's incredible, and you know, in my research, I found this wonderful video, which I was happy to, some of my friends at ISKCON had also not seen it. So it was Allen Ginsberg.
The poet?
Yeah, you know, the famous television debates between Allen Ginsberg and William Buckley Jr., you know, the radical left and the radical right, so to speak, you know, the sort of leading intellectual lights of the left and, of course, the conservatives, which is William Buckley. So they're having all these televised debates about the future of America and what should happen and so on and so forth, and discussing war. And at one moment, Allen Ginsberg tells William Buckley that, you know, you're not understanding what I'm trying to say. Maybe you'll understand if I sing it to you. And you can see from William Buckley's face that he's like, what are you even talking about? And he pulls out this little harmonium, like, I kid you not, like this from under the chair. I don't know where he had it, but he pulls it out and he begins to play the harmonium on that TV set and starts to sing Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Returns in the Bhagavad Gita every time there's a flood, fire, original sin leading to atom bombs. Hare Krishna, Krishna
And you can see that William Buckley Jr., who has no context of this at all and he has no idea what's going on, he's like, what is this?
Right.
And he's like, oh, if you listen carefully, this is the path to peace. As opposed to, of course, the Vietnam War and so on and so forth. So, it's an incredible moment, right? I think of that moment compared to the moment when Swami Vivekananda told all those people in the Chicago Parliament of Religions that, the truth was there in the Vedanta, and everybody was free to access it, right? So we have not held up these moments as moments of the East teaching us something to the West. We talk about Vishwaguru and so on and so forth. But what does that really mean? And I think it means things like this. It means moments like this when the East was able to drive a sort of flag of understanding and comprehension and compassion at the very heart of the West. Right. So Vivekananda is, of course, one great figure. Srila Prabhupada is the other. Because remember, in the 10 years, 11 years that Srila Prabhupada lived after he landed in America, he built temples in, he built 100 temples. Right? In every conceivable part of the world,
Yes.
From Austria to Australia, so to speak. So it was an incredible journey, right? For a 70-year-old man who really lived only till about 80. But I don't think his story has been well understood and really held up as somebody who did something really breakthrough. And I hope this book will help many, many more people understand why this man was important.
I'm really confident that it will. Let's talk a little bit about how exactly it impacted the pop culture of that time, which is the most exciting part of the interview for me. The Beatles were about to break up. I think this was prior to meeting Sri Prabhupada, and he influenced George Harrison,
who wrote songs, which had Krishna consciousness. And remember, Prabhupada himself created a record which became very, very popular with the Hare Krishna mantra, right? I mean, it was incredible.
Does it have to do with the Western philosophy perhaps not having that kind of depth that the Eastern philosophy offers, perhaps because if we look at the entire hippie movement, it was some sort of a look east, sort of an attitude for the people who were tired of the Cambodia War, Vietnam War, and the continuous loss of lives that were happening there. So maybe it was very timely that Prabhupada offered such depth and such philosophy that the American people perhaps...
No, look, I mean, there's certainly something to the fact that the West has always looked to the East for certain kinds of... and some of it is a bit of a cliche also, but there is that thing, right? But as I've written in my book, even before George Harrison, met Srila Prabhupada, he was already talking about the fact that, they had basically got everything, because these were these boys from England who basically had become the world's greatest music band ever. So they had everything, fame, adulation, almost unlimited amounts of money, crazy fans chasing them everywhere. And again, I discovered this interview of George Harrison where he talks about it and he's like, we got everything and then we realized it was not enough, something was missing. And I think in order to understand that, you also have to have a certain depth, and I think maybe George Harrison did. So he obviously realized that there was something missing, and so did John Lennon, of course, right? I mean, so there was obviously something, and they were obviously trying to figure out that there was something missing, and how do they fix that, and so on and so forth. Which is when they met the ISKCON people, and then met Srila Prabhupada, and so on and so forth. And Srila Prabhupada's message, as always, was incredibly stark and clear. I mean, he essentially said that, look, you need to submit to a higher power. And remember, George Harrison helped ISKCON get the Bhakti, what is today called the Bhakti Vedanta Manor in England, and so on and so forth. And I believe the Harrison family is still close to ISKCON. So this is an incredible interaction between the East and the West. If you read my book, you'll see it begins by George Harrison being in an aircraft, and the aircraft seems like it's going to crash, and he's sort of singing Hare, or chanting to himself, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. So he sort of, you know, how this entire interaction changes his life in many ways. And George Harrison, of course, goes on to then create his own music and write his songs and so on and so forth, and continues to have a lifelong relationship with this. When, you know, George Harrison was dying, on his deathbed, so to speak, there were two ISKCON monks who were sort of, you know, praying for him and chanting for him. Right. So he really obviously had a lifelong engagement with Krishna consciousness. So these are obviously great, and obviously ISKCON grew also in a sense because the power of such associations spread the word very far and wide, right? Both through Allen Ginsberg and later George Harrison and so on and so forth. But you asked me something, and let me answer that. You know, what kind of elements did ISKCON bring to the West?
Yes.
And I said in one of my lectures, you know, think about it in San Francisco, which, you know, they used to have these gigantic sort of musical festivals because, you know, anti-Vietnam War and so on and so forth. And there, Srila Prabhupada, in a city where all these huge sort of musical events were happening, he introduced the Rath Yatra from Jagannath Puri onto the streets of San Francisco, which, if you think about it, is such an incredible thing, right? Because he was essentially saying, well, you know, you have all these mega festivals, you know, we have the, you know, mother of all festivals, so to speak. And imagine, I mean, I sometimes think, what did those Americans who saw those rathas on the streets of San Francisco really think for the first time, you know? They would have never seen anything like that. And just the sheer spectacle, just the sheer scale of it all is incredible, right? I mean, imagine, you know, we're not talking about today, we're not talking about 2022, you know, 30, 40 years ago, you know, on the streets of San Francisco, these huge wooden, you know, rathas. And then, you know, Srila Prabhupada was somebody who had a sense for the grand spectacle, because he had made his life so much of a celebration in the name of Krishna, that he was able to conceptualize large-scale things, you know. And you know, you live in Bangalore, and today when you go to, say, the Rajadiraja Govinda temple, or you go to Vrindavan, you see the Chandrodaya temple that is being built, you see that in some senses ISKCON still continues this journey, right? Yes. Of doing things at scale, at a very grand scale, right? That, of course, comes from Prabhupada, you know, the idea that anything done for the Lord has to be in the biggest scale, you know. Yes. Even Akshay Patra, you know, Srila Prabhupada, a very tender-hearted man, you know, saw a child eating leftovers, you know, cheek by jowl, as it were, with dogs, and you know, said that if we cannot even feed people, and if people are hungry, then, you know, what service are we providing to the Lord, right? And said that within a 10-kilometer radius of an ISKCON temple, nobody will ever go hungry. So today you think about, you know, one of the great things that people think about, even people who are not Hindus or don't know much about Indian philosophy, they think about ISKCON and food, you know.
The kitchens, the massive
I mean, when I was at Oxford, I mean, do you know, one of the things that is very famous in Oxford is that the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies is headed by somebody who's affiliated to ISKCON, has every Wednesday this really wonderful vegetarian lunch. And it's actually known all across Oxford that, you know, you go to OCHS, so to speak, because the food is wonderful and it's vegetarian and so on and so forth. I used to go there many times to eat that vegetarian food. It was great. So these massive kitchens that you're talking about, including Akshay Patra, you know, it started in Bangalore, feeding millions and millions of children through midday meals and schemes and so on and so forth, right? So this idea that people shouldn't go hungry, that food should be given to everybody, these are all Srila Prabhupada's ideas, right? And you know,
millions of people are fed today because of that.
And through the pandemic, you know, millions of people fed through the pandemic, all because of the vision of Srila Prabhupada. So
because this comes especially at a time when there is some sort of a united defamation against Hindu temples. If you look at popular culture, you say that you see the images where food is being wasted, it's being thrown away, but it's exactly the opposite. Water is being recycled, there's a lot of renewable energy in the infrastructure around the temples, and the temples are perhaps meeting the kind of purposes that they were originally meant for.
Yeah, no, quite right. Look, I mean, there will always be, as long as Hinduism, you know, as long as Hindus didn't step up and speak for themselves, I think it was all fine. But look, India is a rising power. India is majority Hindu, and India's diaspora is majority Hindu. One of the most successful diasporas in the world, one of the best educated, in every country, wherever there's Indian diaspora, the model minority, the Indian diaspora doesn't go and knife anybody, the Indian diaspora doesn't go and bomb anybody, the Indian diaspora creates no trouble at all, right? I was telling somebody from the UK the other day, it's not the Indian diaspora who creates grooming gangs in the UK, So, such a successful community, the Hindus, will want their share of attention, right? I mean, and why not? I mean, I think the community contributes positively in every part of the world where Hindus are, right? And finally, the Hindus are at a point where they're saying that, look, we contribute so much, education, money, talent, skills. Therefore, we deserve more attention, more protection, a better status, and I think that's absolutely fair, and you'll see that this happen more and more, because as India rises, we are the 5th largest economy now, we'll probably be the 3rd largest economy.
On the lines of how anti-Semitism grew after Jews.
Yeah, but the Jews were always a very small community. I'm saying the Hindus are much larger, right? I mean, we are 1.4 billion people now, maybe at one day we will be 1.5 billion people. So we are really talking about upwards of 1 billion people, around the world. And that's no small number. That's a huge part of the world's population. So it's just that till now, Hindus were not, in a sense, cohesed together as a voice. I think that's happening more and more. And I think whenever there is persecution or oppression or anything like that, I think Hindus are beginning to speak together in one voice. That's really important. And that, of course, the detractors won't like, and so on and so forth. And of course, fundamentally, nobody wants another rising power in the world, right? I mean, that's not hard to see. So these things will happen. I, for one, don't pay too much attention to the negative. I really feel there's so much positive work to be done, and so much positive conversations to be had, that wasting time in the negative is not very helpful. However, we should, as you correctly point out, we should highlight what's really happening, what's going on. I mean, even the UK, you alluded to tax and so on and so forth, including on the temple in the UK. I mean, only a couple of years ago, the Indian embassy in the UK was attacked a couple of times, right? I mean, in Canada, that, banned militant group is organizing all kinds of nefarious activities and so on and so forth. All of this has gone on for a long time. It's just that I think we as a country and as a community did not push back enough. And I think we are now beginning to really push back. And
I'm really glad that you said that, because I was having a conversation with people from ISKCON, and I think this was during when the Bangladesh attacks took place in Dhaka. So I was speaking to Radha Ramandas ji Prabhu, and he was quite emotional then, and then he did not want to address the media, but since he had a little bit of respect and he knew that I would not sensationalize things, he agreed to speak to me. And then when I heard the cries of the victims and how it was actually reflected by a certain representative of ISKCON, one thing that I heard, and it's a very rare, I would say, acceptance of the fact that yes, we have become somewhat submissive because we have been a largely peaceful community, so we don't resort to violence, obviously, but it's time that we at least defend ourselves is the call that I heard from a few people in ISKCON.
Yeah, that's certainly true, and in Bangladesh, for instance, it's been happening for a long time, This is not new in Bangladesh, and this is not to say that, certain Bangladeshi governments, especially Sheikh Hasina's government, hasn't tried to help Hindu communities, Durga Pujas and so on and so forth. And the number of Durga Pujas, from what I understand, is also increasing and so on and so forth. However, attacks on Hindu centers and on Hindus have happened in Bangladesh for a long time, A few years ago, there were threatening messages being sent to the elderly monk who was head of Ramakrishna Mission in Dhaka, and then the government had to give him protection and so on and so forth. So, I mean, at the end of the day, how did the Hindu populations of many of these countries neighboring ours disappear.
Right.
Where did these people go, right?
So at least today there's the media which can amplify that and sort of bring it to the limelight.
You know, it's constantly minorities, essentially Hindus are being wiped out, you know. There's so much talk about minority rights in different parts of the world. What about the minorities in our neighboring countries, right? You know, what about Hindus and also Sikhs, you know, in Pakistan, for instance.
But this is one criticism about ISKCON, is that there is that aggression which is perhaps missing, because that aggression is a very positive one in terms of defending yourself.
But most Hindu organizations are not aggressive, no? There are very few Hindu organizations. And look, and you have to also understand that if you want to do spiritual work, I mean, there are very few spiritual organizations from India that have ever been aggressive. Most of them are very, you know, devoted to public service, they're devoted to the spiritual part of the work, right? It is upon the larger community to defend these organizations. Right. It's a bit unfair to expect these organizations to defend themselves. That's not their job. And there's no point comparing with somebody else and say, oh, but you know, they are doing, but like, that's not the right comparison. So there are very few Hindu organizations who have the capability of defending themselves. It is upon the larger Hindu community, right, you know, to come together and defend these organizations because of the valuable role that they play in each of our spiritual lives, right? I think that's important to underline. And, you know, we shouldn't leave it to the organizations to defend themselves. I mean, to imagine, it's a bit like, you know, your spiritual community is like your family, right? Yeah. Today your family is attacked. You're not going to say that, oh, why are we not trained in, like, I don't know, warfare, and why don't we have weapons? You would say it's the job of the state to protect us, right? Absolutely. The police and so on and so forth, and law authorities to protect us. Same thing. I mean, the organizations are not geared to protecting themselves. Yes, should they be more vocal? Sure. I mean, that's valid, you know, one should be more vocal and so on and so forth. Yeah. But as far as real protection is concerned, it's up to the society, to be honest.
And what do you think made the ISKCON movement, the Krishna movement in India popular? Because obviously it started off in a very big way in the West, but then today it's everywhere in India.
Yeah. See, Krishna consciousness is embedded in Indian life, right? I mean, please remember, you know, Gandhi carried the Bhagavad Gita constantly with him, right? Swami Vivekananda spoke about the Bhagavad Gita, and you know, the Bhagavad Gita is really one of those epochal books of our civilization, right? Therefore, the idea of Krishna consciousness has been there with us long before ISKCON came into being. This is a old Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, and it's in every part of India, right? I mean, some people worship Krishna as Srinathji, some people worship Krishna as Gopala, right, some people worship Krishna as Krishna, and so on and so forth, right? So it's everywhere. You know, I recently was in Kerala, in Thiruvananthapuram, and I went to see the great reclining Vishnu, Ananta Padmanabha Swami, you know. Incredible. I mean, you think of thousands of years ago, you know, in the middle of a forest, there's this cave essentially, and this temple, and there you have, you know, the carved Vishnu.
Still so much mystery around that place. Yeah. There's still so much that we don't know.
We really don't. And, you know, and I met Her Highness the Princess, you know, from the Royal House of Thiruvananthapuram, Travancore, and we had a lovely conversation. And yeah, like, I mean, you know, so, I mean, the people don't realize that, you know, Ananta Padmanabha Swami is the presiding deity of Thiruvananthapuram, right? Quite like Mahakal is the presiding deity of Ujjain, and Lord Shiva is the presiding deity of Kashi, right? All of this consciousness is there in our society. It's just that over the years, because of various reasons, and we don't have time to go into all the reasons, you know, a lot of it has been forgotten. People were ashamed to say these things. So there were all kinds of manias. Yeah, it's a form of reintroduction, reinvention, you know, rekindling. It's all, you know, our natural self is all coming out.
But today, do you think...
I'll give you an example. You know, I went to see RRR, right? Yeah. And there's that scene towards the end of the film where Ram Charan is, you know, fighting these British soldiers in a forest. And there's this statue of Lord Ram. Yes. And he's sort of hiding there and so on and so forth. And then, like, he doesn't have clothes because he's just been rescued from this prison. Yeah. So he sort of takes the saffron robes that were there on the statue, and then he sort of drapes it around himself, and then takes the bows and arrows, and there's a scene where you sort of, from the smoke and the fire, you suddenly see him shooting an arrow. I was in a cinema hall in Delhi, where I live. The whole audience began to say Jai Shri Ram, Jai Jai Shri Ram, and they knew that this is not Shri Ram. The character is something else, the movie is something else, but this identification is so strong. Even the director therefore has used that song, right? The background music that plays when Ramcharan appears, and it says Shri Ram Raghavam, Ramam Raghavam, something, right?
It's mostly that we are getting reconnected with that consciousness.
Yeah, and I'm just saying, like, how people connect, right? And they know what's going on, and what this image reminds them of. And they know that, okay, in the film it's the character of Alluri Sita Ramaraju, right? And he's fighting the British and blah blah, and I've seen like 2.5 3 hours of the film. But when that image comes on the screen, your innate sort of social consciousness reminds you that this image is from your deep from your society's culture and civilization and so on and so forth. And you see it and you're like, okay, this reminds you. And because it's North India, they know, and that comes out naturally. It's almost like it comes out naturally from them. Absolutely. Right? So this is all there in people. It's generations of conditioning, exposure, knowledge, seeping through, from parent to children for generation after generation after generation after generation. So this is not easy to wipe out. All of this had got buried in a sort of, what should I say, false consciousness, right?
But what do you think
all of this is reappearing,
maintains and pushes that spirituality forward or the religiosity forward even in the younger generation? Because if you look at the West, and I don't have any solid statistics with me, but presumably one can say that perhaps the third generation is far less religious than the first or the second, because in an age of Christopher Hitchens and all the atheist movements going forward, in India it's the complete opposite. People are very attracted.
West, more and more people now call themselves SBNR, spiritual but not religious.
Okay.
So, especially in Christianity, and there's a revival of Christianity also in some pockets, but in Christianity, a lot of the Christian world, see, everybody wants some sort of spirituality in their lives. It's about community, it's about having an inner life, all sorts of things, right? See, in human history, there's never been a time like, the last 30, 40 years when most people never had an inner life. You see, if you think about your parents or my parents or anybody, they always had some form of spiritual life. There would be some puja at home, they would go on a Tuesday to the temple or Monday or whatever, whichever day they chose or whichever deity they worshipped. There was some spiritual connection in their lives. In the last 30, 40 years, it was a bit unique. So all of that got destroyed, right? And got buried in this sort of attempt to be modern and so on and so forth. But even in the West, people want that, right? I mean, that hunger is there in every individual. What they don't want is a superstructure. They don't want some, presiding authority to tell them, now you eat this, you live here, right?
Particular framework, so to speak.
Yeah, they don't want a framework. So then now a lot of people call themselves SBNR, spiritual but not religious. What does it mean? It means in many cases that they do yoga, they might be meditating. Many people of them are turning vegan.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. It's been absolutely lovely speaking to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
In fact, towards the beginning of the conversation, I just wanted to ask you if I can call you Dr. Sengupta or Hindol or Dada.
Just Hindol or Dada would do.
Dada is a form of respect. My Bengali friends get carried away when I say that.
Well, Dada, and I think a lot of non-Bengalis don't understand this. Dada is usually to an elder brother. But I see that a lot of people say Dada to any Bengali they see.
Right.
But usually in Bengali, Dada would be and Bhai would be to younger brothers.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dada, for joining.
Thank you.
And
it was great fun talking to you.
Please do let our audience know how they can purchase your book, where they can purchase your book, and what exactly can be offered through this book.
Well, Sing, Dance and Pray is this wonderful, wonderful story of Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada, of course, the founding Acharya of ISKCON, taught Krishna consciousness around the world. I said in one of my lectures that even if nothing changes through a book, the author changes. My life changed through this book. I took up chanting seriously after reading this book, and I think I have found much of value to learn from in Srila Prabhupada's life. An incredible man, going at the age of 70 with only 40 rupees in his pocket to America to teach Krishna consciousness and building a global movement. I hope you will read Sing, Dance and Pray, because that really was Srila Prabhupada's message: to find Krishna, to find the love of Krishna, to submit to the divine will of Krishna through singing, dancing and praying. And of course, you can see this interview with me on Swarajya and Bharatvaarta. I've really enjoyed having this conversation. Do please subscribe to Swarajya and Bharatvaarta for more such incredible conversations. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Do let us know what you thought about this conversation in the comment section below. And I would entertain any form of questions or criticism or comments about this particular interview, barring the fact that my head has too much coconut oil. I cannot really help you with that. Thank you so much for tuning in. Do let us know what you thought about this.